It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Despite thousands of cancellations in protest, the Eurovision Song Contest will take place in Tel Aviv on May 14th to the 16th. It's been made possible only through a ceasefire, which was signed between the Israeli government and the Hamas party. As we speak, a delegation of Qatarians are now in the Gaza Strip delivering about $30 million worth of emergency assistance, which will help Palestinians survive a little longer under the siege imposed by the Israeli military. It is noteworthy that Qatar is delivering the aid, although the responsibility of the well-being of a population under military occupation rests in the shoulders of the occupier. In this case, Israel, according to international law. Joining me now to talk about all of this is Asad Abukhalil, professor of political science at California State University in Stanislaus, and he blogs regularly at the Angry Arab News Service. Asad, good to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, Asad, the big question here is, why is Qatar doing this? Why is Qatar helping Israel finance the occupation of Palestinians and Palestinian territory and the Palestinian Authority? The speculation is, of course, that they're being pressured to do this by the U.S. government to help stabilize the ceasefire with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think the Qatar regime is basically investing in the Israeli occupation. As your intro indicated, the responsibility of the upkeep and taking care of the population under occupation in Gaza and the West Bank and the whole of Palestinians in historic Palestine are under Israeli occupation, are the responsibility of the occupiers, and that's the Israeli government. Basically, the Qatar regime, all Gulf regimes are racing to accommodate themselves and to ingratiate themselves with the Trump administration. They are doing their best to get closer to Trump by getting closer to the Israelis. We see a race of normalization among all Gulf regimes, from Oman, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and now Qatar. And Qatar's relation with the Israelis go all the way back to the 90s. In fact, they were the first to openly initiate normalization measures than all other Gulf regimes, which maintain secret ties under the table. What they were doing now, basically, is to reverse their long-standing policies of basically sponsoring the Hamas organization movement in the Gaza Strip. They are extending a grant of $300 million to the collaborationist regime of Mahmoud Abbas in West Bank. And by doing so, they are saving it from utter collapse, because that regime survives on the external sponsorship and arming by the enemies of the Palestinian people, the Israelis, the Gulf regime, the Americans, the Europeans, and so on. So they want to basically spare Israel a major disaster on their hand by protecting the survival of the Palestinian collaborationist regime in Ramallah. We should also bear in mind that the Israelis are very keen on the preservation on the Palestinian Authority by virtue of the coordination, security coordination between the Palestinian collaborationist regime and the Israeli government. And basically, it's a collaboration that is intended against any manifestation of Palestinian defiance and resistance. And to that end, the Palestinian Collaborationist Authority arrests people based on posts they put on Facebook or Twitter. They arrest them for standing up to the Israeli occupation and so on. And that's what Qatar is doing. It's a very sinister thing, presenting itself to the world as if it's a humanitarian gesture when it isn't. It's a service to the occupation.
All right, Asad, we know Mahmoud Abbas has a very good relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is now waging a prolonged campaign to isolate and impose embargoes on Qatar. Now, explain the tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia in relation to the Palestinian question.
There are schisms and divisions within the pro-American regional order in the Middle East. It has been the case for many long time. But Jordan and Qatar have had feuds. Saudi Arabia and UAE had feuds in the past and so on. So this should not in any way undermine the reality of that all of them in the end fall into the US-Israeli camp. We should remember that Qatar is the most generous, largest host of US troops in the entire region, and many of America's military operation and occupation spring from bases in Qatar itself. You're right, there are factions within the pro-American camp in the region, and within the Arab counter-revolution, which began since 2011, there are factions. There is the UAE Saudi Arabia faction, and there is the Qatari faction. They disagree on who they want to pick and install in power. But the fact is, both camps are fundamentally anti-democratic. Both of them are normalizing with the Israeli occupation state. And both of them are trying desperately to ingratiate themselves with the Trump administration. And fourthly, both of them are enemies of programs of social justice, progressiveness, leftism, feminism in the Middle East region.
The Israelis, Assad, gambled that if enough artists will ignore the boycott, the Eurovision will become a show of strength for Israel, legitimizing the occupation. Now, Hamas has also gambled that the Eurovision is so important to Israelis that they will agree to the ceasefire, and somehow, maybe assistance was offered in exchange so that they can survive a little bit longer. It seems that the gamble paid off for Israel and it paid off for Hamas, while nonviolent Palestinian resistance movement did not achieve much. What do you make of that?
Well, I have been arguing for many years that Hamas has reached a bankrupt dead end, and that the future of Hamas can be read through the history of the Fatah movement, which resides in Ramallah today. It has basically failed in their agenda and failed to present a real credible alternative to Fatah organization. And the way they managed Gaza Strip has been quite repressive and unimaginable and unrevolutionary. And they also, like their rivals in Ramallah, have been repressed freedom of expression inside the Strip itself. Having said all that, the responsibility for all that goes within Gaza and the West Bank, which are territories under occupation, should be blamed squarely on the Israeli occupation and its sponsor in Washington, D.C. Hamas today is resorting to reliance on the Egyptian mediation between it and the Israelis, when the Egyptian regime or the Egyptian dictatorship is a sworn enemy to the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas used to count itself as a branch. And the Egyptian dictatorship is extremely close to the Israelis, and they do not in any way have the best interests of the Palestinian people at heart. So the fact that they are resorting to the mediation of the Egyptians tell me that they basically have no alternative. They have no agenda, no program, nothing to offer. And they're just counting the days until maybe they reach an accommodation with the occupation and the West Bank regime in Ramallah.
And that was Assad Abukhalil. He joined me from California. And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.